toddlers. I read where a toddler or a young child laughs 300 times a day. The average adult laughs.
Behind closed doors, power rarely looks the way it does on stage. It is quieter, heavier. Decisions are not applauded, they are endured for every public triumph. There are negotiations that test loyalty, compromises that blur moral lines, and nights spent weighing conscience against consequence. Success, at this level, is never clean. It demands trade-offs that are invisible to the crowd but permanent to the soul. As influence grows. So, as isolation, trust becomes selective. Conversations are measured, even family ties strain under the pressure of expectation and inheritance. Those closest are no longer just loved ones. They are stakeholders, symbols, liabilities. The past resurfaces not as memory, but as leverage. Childhood lessons, once simple, now echo with new meaning. Survival instincts replace ideals. Vision sharpens, but innocence fades. And then come the cracks. Small at first, a rumor dismissed, a warning ignored, a decision justified just this once. But power magnifies everything. Mistakes included. What once felt controlled begins to spiral, pulling personal sacrifice into public consequence. The narrative shifts. Admirers become critics, silence becomes suspicion, and the same world that elevated them watches closely, waiting for proof of either redemption or collapse. Yet, this is not merely a story of downfall or victory. It is a study of humanity under pressure, of what ambition reveals when no one is watching, of how far someone will go to protect what they've built, and who they're willing to become in the process. Because at its core, influence is not about commanding others. It is about wrestling oneself. This journey forces a reckoning, not just with the world, but with the mirror. And as the final chapters approach, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Success does not ask whether you are ready. It only asks what you are willing to lose. As adolescence approached, the expectations grew sharper, more defined. The family name carried weight, and with it came an unspoken rule. Failure was not an option. Faith was preached as unconditional. Yet performance was constantly measured. Every gesture mattered. Every word reflected not just personal belief, but the legacy of those who came before him. He learned early that love and approval often arrived hand in hand with achievement. In private moments, doubt crept in, questions he never voiced, conflicts he never confessed. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing contradictions between what was preached publicly and what unfolded behind closed doors. Faith inspired hope, but it also demanded sacrifice, emotional, personal, and sometimes moral. He began to understand that influence was not merely about belief, but about control, of narrative, about knowing when to speak and, more importantly, when to remain silent. Young adulthood sharpened these instincts. Opportunities appeared not because he demanded them, but because others assumed his destiny. Doors opened before he knocked, and still, he hesitated, not from humility, but from calculation. He studied how authority moved through rooms, how crowds responded to confidence, how vulnerability could be weaponized and sincerity carefully curated. Inside, the tension intensified. The desire to honor family clashed with the urge to redefine the mission entirely. He wanted more than inheritance, he wanted authorship. To shape something that belonged to him, even if it meant bending the structure he was born into. Each step forward required compromise, each compromise left a mark. These years forged the blueprint, the calm exterior, the measured tone, the ability to command attention without demanding it. What the world would later interpret as charisma was, in truth, survival refined into strategy. And long before the cameras arrived, the empire was already being rehearsed, quietly, patiently, relentlessly. With visibility came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came fear, not of failure, but of exposure. He understood that media did not simply amplify truth, it reshaped it. Narratives could be softened, sharpened, or erased entirely depending on who controlled the lens. And for the first time, he realized that belief itself could be engineered, not fabricated, but guided, framed, protected from contradiction. Success followed, slowly at first, then all at once. Ratings climbed, donations increased, invitations expanded beyond local networks into national conversations. What began as a technical role evolved into authority, not granted, but assumed. Viewers didn't just listen, they trusted, and trust, once earned, became the most powerful currency of all. But power demanded a price. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. The expectations of family, the demands of followers, the constant performance of certainty, all collided. Doubt was no longer a private burden, it was a liability. Questions had to be buried beneath confidence. Vulnerability, once human, became dangerous. He learned to compartmentalize. The public figure was polished, reassuring, unwavering. The private self carried anxiety, calculation, and the weight of sustaining belief at scale. Each broadcast tightened the bind. Stepping away was no longer an option. The machine required feeding, content, conviction, consistency. And then came the realization that influence, once unleashed, cannot be undone. Words linger, images repeat, audiences grow dependent. What began as stewardship slowly resembled ownership of platforms, of narratives, of people's hopes. By the time the empire took recognizable shape, the lines were already blurred. Faith and branding intertwined. Message and messenger became inseparable. And standing beneath the lights he once controlled from the shadows, he understood the truth he had always feared. The stage does not merely elevate, it consumes. As the crowd swelled, the line between leader and symbol began to dissolve. He was no longer just a voice delivering messages, he had become the message itself. His image, his cadence, his optimism, all were replicated, quoted, and projected far beyond the walls of the church. With that transformation came a new responsibility, consistency. Any deviation, any visible crack, risked shaking the faith of millions who had tethered their hope to his certainty. Private life faded into the background. Personal grief, exhaustion, and doubt were postponed indefinitely, buried beneath schedules and expectations. There was no room for vulnerability in a system fueled by assurance. Even moments of silence were interpreted as intention. Every absence invited speculation. So, he remained present, always polished, always available, always on. The organization grew more complex, more corporate. Advisors replaced elders, metrics replaced intuition. Success was measured not only in souls reached, but in engagement, revenue, and reach. The language of faith merged seamlessly with the language of branding. Sermons became campaigns, conferences became productions, and the leader became both shepherd and CEO. Yet beneath the efficiency, a quiet unease persisted. Influence at the scale no longer belonged solely to him. It had momentum, expectations, and consequences beyond individual control. A single misinterpreted phrase could ignite controversy. A personal failure could become a public reckoning. The margin for error had vanished. Still, he pressed forward, not out of ego, but obligation. The machine could not slow. Too many livelihoods depended on it. Too many believers looked to him for direction. To stop would mean collapse, not just of an institution, but of trust itself. And so the stage grew brighter, the applause louder, and the silence behind the curtain heavier. Because while the world saw triumph, what remained hidden was the cost of sustaining belief when the empire could no longer distinguish faith from momentum. What became impossible to ignore was the shift in dynamics. Controversy was no longer a threat. It was a resource. Each accusation widened the audience. Each debate reinforced relevance. In a media ecosystem driven by outrage and visibility, silence was riskier than confrontation, and so the narrative evolved, not through denials, but through reframing. Criticism was cast as persecution, scrutiny as misunderstanding, wealth as evidence of blessing rather than excess. Inside the organization, loyalty hardened, longtime supporters closed ranks, viewing attacks not as warnings, but as proof that the mission mattered. Doubt was externalized, questioning became synonymous with betrayal. A subtle but powerful boundary formed between us and them, insulating the core from fracture. The empire did not retreat, it fortified doubt at the center. The man adapted, his tone softened publicly, sharpened privately. Messaging grew more deliberate, more disciplined. Words were chosen not just for meaning, but for survivability. Appearances were calculated, absences explained. Every crisis produced a revised playbook, refined through repetition. Yet the human cost accumulated quietly. Living under constant surveillance reshaped instinct. Trust narrowed, vulnerability vanished. Even genuine moments of compassion were filtered through optics, their sincerity forever questioned. There was no longer a private self untouched by interpretation. Everything belonged to the audience. And still, the machine advanced. New platforms, new demographics, new markets, faith crossed borders, and algorithms alike. Evolving into a global product of reassurance and resilience, the message remained simple, repeatable, comforting, even as the structure supporting it grew increasingly complex. What emerged was not just a ministry, but a phenomenon shaped by its critics as much as its believers. Because in the modern age, power does not depend on approval, it depends on attention. And as long as eyes remained fixed on the stage, the empire stood, resilient, controversial, and profoundly human. Within the walls of home, the performance softened, but it never fully disappeared. Conversations were careful. Boundaries blurred between parent and leader, spouse and partner, family and institution. Decisions made at the dinner table carried consequences far beyond it. The weight of influence followed them into ordinary moments, turning privacy into a luxury rarely afforded. The spouse, often perceived as a supporting figure, became a stabilizing force, translating ambition into restraint, vision into sustainability. Whereas instincts lean toward expansion, there's lean toward preservation. This quiet negotiation shaped the ministry as much as any sermon. Influence, after all, is rarely maintained alone. It survives through alignment. For the children, legacy was both inheritance and burden. They were expected to embody values before fully choosing them. Mistakes that would be private for others became lessons played out in public. Growth occurred under observation, leaving little room for anonymity or rebellion. Identity was forged not in isolation, but under expectation. As years passed, the realization set in that succession was inevitable. The question was not if, but how. Could the empire outlive its architect without losing its soul? Preparing them. Next generation meant more than teaching skills, it meant transferring belief without coercion, authority without entitlement, a delicate balance few ever master. And beneath it all lingered a quieter fear that the institution might one day overshadow the relationships that built it. That ambition, left unchecked, could consume intimacy. These were the questions no broadcast addressed, no sermon resolved. Yet despite the strain, the family endured, not perfectly, but intentionally, bound by loyalty, tested by visibility, and shaped by purpose. Because in the end, the truest measure of influence is not how many follow, but what remains when the lights dim, the crowds disperse, and only family is left standing. What emerged was not merely a ministry adapted to the digital age, but an institution fluent in its language. Algorithms replaced styles. Engagement metrics became modern-day attendance sheets. Influence was no longer confined to geography or time zones. It lived permanently in feeds, notifications, and replayed. Clips. A single sentence could travel farther in seconds than sermons once did in decades. With that reach came a subtle shift in authority. Followers no longer waited for Sundays. Guidance arrived daily, sometimes hourly, shaping mindset, behavior, and belief in real time. Inspiration became habitual. Dependence followed quietly. The line between encouragement and expectation blurred as audiences built emotional routines. Around the message, internally, the pace intensified. Content calendars never rested. Relevance demanded constant presence. Silence risked irrelevance. Teams expanded to sustain momentum. Strategists, editors, crisis managers, brand architects. Faith now required infrastructure, and infrastructure demanded constant growth to justify its existence. The pressure to remain authentic grew heavier with each expansion. Authenticity, once natural, now had to be preserved intentionally. Every unscripted moment risked misinterpretation. Every pause invited speculation. Transparency became performance adjacent, carefully offered, never uncontrolled. And yet, the formula worked. The message resonated across cultures, generations, and ideologies. It adapted without losing familiarity, comforting without confronting, empowering without destabilizing. In an uncertain world, certainty became the product, and it sold. But beneath the polished ecosystem lingered an unspoken question. Could belief survive optimization? Could faith remain sacred when measured, tested, and scaled? The empire thrived by answering with action rather than reflection, because in a world ruled by visibility, the most powerful message is the one that never leaves the screen. And as long as the voice remained present, reassuring, confident, unwavering, the influence endured, evolving beyond ministry into something far larger, far more permanent. What became clear over time was that chaos no longer disrupted the system, it activated it. Crises triggered, protocols refined through repetition. Statements were drafted within hours. Appearances were scheduled with precision. Silence was weighed as carefully as speech. Every response balanced empathy with control, ensuring that emotion never outpaced narrative. To supporters, this consistency signaled leadership, calm in the storm, strength under pressure. Critics, it felt rehearsed, brief process through strategy rather than reflection. But intention mattered less than outcome. The institution remained intact. Attendance held, engagement spiked. Even tragedy fed visibility. Internally, these moments extracted a toll. Staff navigated moral ambiguity under relentless deadlines. Security tightened. Legal teams expanded. Risk assessments became routine. Faith had to coexist with contingency. Planning, trust with surveillance. Hope with liability. The leader himself grew more guarded. Each crisis narrowed the margin for authenticity. Raw emotion risked misinterpretation. Admission invited exploitation, and so composure became armor. The smile steadied. The voice softened. The message reaffirmed certainty even when certainty was hardest to maintain. Yet paradoxically, these trials deepened devotion. Shared adversity forged identity. We endured this together became a refrain. Criticism unified believers, reinforcing loyalty through opposition. The movement no longer revolved solely around inspiration, it revolved around defense. What emerged was a phenomenon shaped as much by resistance as belief. A system strengthened by pressure, not weakened by it. Each crisis became proof of resilience, evidence that the structure could withstand scrutiny, shock, and sorrow. But beneath the fortified narrative lingered unresolved questions. Who decides when compassion ends and calculation begins? At what point does survival eclipse sincerity? These were questions left unanswered, not because they lacked importance, but because the empire could not afford to ask them publicly. And so the story continued, resilient, polished, and profoundly shaped by the storms it refused to let define. It died inside that constant calculation exists a private discipline few ever witness. Emotions are processed not by expression, but by filtration. What can be shown? What must be concealed? What might be misunderstood? Over time, instinct replaces spontaneity. Even genuine reactions are examined before release. Shaped by the awareness that millions are always watching, the mind adapts to this environment, but not without consequence. Hypervigilance becomes normal. Rest feels undeserved. Silence feels dangerous. The absence of attention triggers unease, while its presence exhausts. Influence demands continuous confirmation that the message still resonates. That authority remains intact. That belief has not begun to drift. Decision-making grows increasingly solitary. Counsel is sought, but final responsibility rests alone. Trust narrows to a small circle, and even within it, doubt lingers. Every advisor has an agenda. Every affirmation may be strategic. Genuine feedback becomes rare, filtered by loyalty or fear of consequence. Over time, identity fuses with role. The leader becomes inseparable from the institution they built. To fail publicly would not merely damage reputation, it would fracture selfhood. And so adaptation continues, messaging evolves, tone softens or sharpens, vulnerability is offered. In controlled doses, enough to appear human, never enough to appear uncertain. Yet beneath the mastery remains a quiet ache, the awareness that admiration is conditional. Love, at scale, is transactional. It endures only as long as certainty is delivered. The leader must always know the answer, even when none exists. This is the unseen cost of influence. Not scandal or criticism, but internal erosion, the slow replacement of self with symbol. And as the years pass, the greatest challenge becomes not maintaining control over the narrative, but remembering who existed before the narrative required control. And all time has a way of clarifying what success cannot. As the years accumulate, the empire stands not just as an achievement, but as a question mark carved into culture. Its architecture is visible, platforms, followers, institutions, but its true footprint exists in quieter places, and the mind shaped by its messages and the choices influenced by its certainty. In the expectations it created about faith, leadership, and reward for some, the impact is undeniable and personal. Words spoken at the right moment redirected lives, restored confidence, or offered comfort when nothing else could for others. The same words symbolized distortion, belief simplified, spirituality commercialized, hope packaged for mass consumption. Both realities coexist, uncomfortable but inseparable. The man at the center has aged alongside the institution. Experience replaced urgency, control replaced experimentation. The early hunger evolved into preservation, not just of relevance, but of meaning. Because when something grows this large, it no longer belongs entirely to its creator, it belongs to the people who project their needs onto it, believers, critics, and observers alike. What remains unresolved is not whether the empire succeeded, but what it ultimately represents. A modern adaptation of faith, a masterclass in influence, a cautionary tale about scale and sincerity, perhaps all at once, perhaps none fully. History will decide in fragments, headlines will fade, metrics will shift, but memory will persist, shaped by emotion more than evidence. And that memory, the story will never be singular. It will be debated, reframed, defended, and dismantled repeatedly, because the most enduring empires are not defined by certainty, but by contradiction. And the most compelling stories are not those that answer every question, but those that leave us examining our own beliefs about power, purpose, and the price we're willing to pay to be heard.